Okay, I've finished all the framing, and I've left a large hole for access to the underside of the stairway. I've designed this stairs so we'll have 36 inches from the inside of our finished skirt board to the center line of our balustrade. That's from here to here. As you can see, we'll need treads which are a little longer than 36. The placement of our cut carriages was determined by how the finished treads and risers will fit in to the newel post. I've put a notch in the subfloor and the hanger board to make installation of the newel post easier later on. An important thing to note is the center line of the balustrade is also the center line of the newel post, and in this case is also even with the front face of our riser. There's a lot more about all these details in the book. And now I'm going to go route the mortises in my skirt board for my finished risers and treads. Okay, I've started laying out my house skirt board. This is the one which will be next to the wall. Into this board I will route my mortises for my risers and my treads. I've drawn this line on the skirt board. I've also drawn that line on my model to show you how my rise and my run will intersect that line when I lay them out with a framing square. These are the same lines of rise and run that were on our cut carriages when this was the top edge of the board. This board is 10.5 inches wide, and I've chosen that width so that I'll have room to route out the entire riser and tread and still have some room between the top of the nosing and the edge of the board.
Now in the old days, these mortises would require a lot of chisel work, but I'm sure glad I have a router. This 3 horsepower plunge router with a 1/2 inch carbide bit will make short work of these mortises. There are several ways to make jigs to cut these mortises, and here I'm using a base-guided jig. A template guided by a bearing over router bit works just as well, and that's in the book. I cut the mortise in several passes to avoid burning. I first follow the perimeter of the mortise and then waste the inside. That's it for one tread mortise. Now for a riser. Now normally I wouldn't switch back and forth between jigs. I would route all the tread mortises and then all the riser mortises.
I've put these scrap pieces in here to test the fit of my mortise. This is a factory laminated red oak tread, and the factory has also rounded the front edge, called the bullnose. The tread comes wide, and I've ripped it to our width of 11 1/8, plus a quarter I've added for the tongue on the back. This tongue will fit into the groove that I've plowed in the front of the riser. I've also plowed a dado on the underside of the tread. The riser fits into this dado, and if there should ever be any shrinkage of the riser, we won't have a crack opening up here. I made these 2 oak wedges on a jig, and in the final installation they'll be glued in place and hold everything tight against the finished face of the mortise. This is what the finished mortise looks like. Let me show you how I add these lines to my original layout so I can make a jig which will cut this mortise. You remember I drew the original lines, run of 10, rise and 7/11/16 with my framing square. Now how these lines intersected my baseline. I then took a piece of riser material, put it in its correct position, and marked its face on this board. I also did the same with a piece of tread, placed it in its proper position, and marked its face. I then took the wedges, put them in their right place, and marked their profiles. These lines now represent the shape of my mortise. Let me show you how the jig fits. I adjusted the distance from the outside of my mortise to the jig to fit my router. So all I have to do is run my router around the outside edges of this jig, and I'll have my mortise cut. Here's the jig for the riser. There's plans for these jigs in the book. I've made this one to fit my router base, but you'll have to adjust this to fit yours. Be sure to try these out on a piece of scrap, because this oak's expensive. Now I'll clamp this down and finish routing my mortises.
Now I have to get rid of all those pencil lines I've made, and I do this with a belt sander. It's a lot easier to sand all those marks off before you get the treads and risers in the way.
Okay, sheetrock's in place. I'm going to drop this guy down, tie it against the wall. I'm going to check in a few spots to make sure that this skirt board is going to work. There's a little wiggle there. The wedge will take most of that up, and looks like my kickboard's sticking out a little far. I'll knock that off with a chisel. Might need a shim in the middle, but it looks like it fits pretty good here. Test it up a little higher. Fits real well there, so I think we're pretty good in that direction. I'm going to grab a tread. Skirt board's a little high here. Let's try up here. A little high there too. And let's check it with a level. Yeah, skirt needs to come up, the tread needs to come up just a little. Now I have a little gap under my tread, between the tread and this carriage. Maybe I'll stick a little shim under there to bring the center carriage up. There, that's nice and solid. Now I'll screw the skirt board tight to the wall and lay out and cut my mitered skirt board.
I'm using my level to help line up the hole with the studs. And as always, you'll have to drill a pilot hole to get through this oak. I'm keeping my holes on the bottom side of the tread where they won't show. You may need some holes above the treads to hold the skirt board tight, and then you'd have to counterbore and plug them.
Back to the model again so I can show you a few things about how we're going to lay out this skirt board. I've drawn a baseline on this model, much like I did on our other skirt board. And through it, I've drawn my rise and my run. There's a little overhang from the rise line to the edge of the skirt board. This is so I can cut the miter. This will mate with the miter on my riser for a nice clean corner with no end grain. Let me show you how this works on this real board. This is our baseline. And this dimension is important only so that our layout doesn't come off the edge of the board. I've laid out my rise and my run intersecting the baseline, and now I'm going to take a piece of riser and lay out the area that will be mitered. Put it in place. Now I'll cut out the waist with a skill saw and saw the miter with a hand saw.
As you can see, I've clamped the skirt board in place on this sawhorse, so I'll be sawing at waist height instead of on my knees. I'll make the cut with a sharp 12-point cross-cut saw. You can make this cut on a table saw or with a skill saw, but I prefer the hand saw method. The bottom riser gets cut all the way through, but I have to complete the next riser with a seat cut.
Now this is just a scrap of sheetrock. Normally the whole wall would be covered. I'll get one last screw in here. Now I have these blocks,